to the niceties of the law. This is Jack Richburg. He's a student right now at Memphis Theological Seminary, because after years of engagement with the law, he decided it was time for grace. Welcome, Jack. Down on my far left, I don't know if that's politically or just geographically. This is Dr. Michael L.W. Moore, who is pastor of Metropolitan Baptist Church and is also a campus chaplain and director of spiritual life at Lemoyne-Owen College right here in Memphis, Tennessee. Next to him is Dr. Lillian Lammers, who is pastor of First Presbyterian Church in downtown Memphis, one of the oldest churches in the city, I believe.
Second oldest.
Second oldest. A beautiful and unique building. So if you have never been to First Presbyterian Church downtown, the building's great, and now the church is even better because Dr. Lammers is there. And then Dr. Ferris Blunt, who is on the faculty here at Memphis Theological Seminary and teaches our Christian Heritage 1 and 2 courses, but is also good in the area of theology, practical theology. So welcome, panelists. I'm really happy that you are here to join into this discussion. And so I'd like to begin with this question, which is, how is affirmative action a theological issue? And then we can get into, some of the legalities and all that if we need to, but I'd like us to begin with, how is affirmative action a theological issue? And I'm not going to call on anybody, but if somebody wants to begin, but I would like to hear from each of the panelists. Okay.
Well, I don't mind starting on that. And I think, I'm a lawyer. Affirmative action is a phrase that originated in the law. And so, but I am also a student here, and I'm learning more and more and more about the history of Christian thought and how it affects me. And one of the things that I've learned and that I truly believe in is Christian transformation. And that is something I think that happens when with a little effort. I think the Spirit guides us and the Spirit points us in the right direction, but it takes affirmative action on our behalf. We have to make a decision and take action to get closer to God's Spirit. And I think if we don't, then we end up not changing and not being transformed. So it's a legal phrase, but it's definitely a theological concept in my mind.
Okay, that works. That works. So, as Dean Gackey framed the question, is affirmative action a theological issue? I thought about the way I teach what the word theology means to my students. So, several definitions, understandings of what theology is, but kind of a simple definition I'll offer to my students in one of my classes is theology just thoughts about God. Like, what do we think about God? What's God to say about things in the world? And so I'll just keep it here for right now. But if we believe God created the world and God has dominion over the world, then God has something to say to everything in the world. And if God has something to say to everything in the world, that includes affirmative action. So I'll keep it there for right now. We can get to further discussion about what that might mean and how I approach it. But if we think that God has thoughts about everything in the world, God also has something to say to us and about us about affirmative action.
I would say that the biggest understanding for me of the gospel of Jesus Christ is one of liberation. And one of the ways that humanity becomes more liberated is through education. And yet, globally, but specifically looking at access to education in this country, it has long been a game of who gets kept out. And so affirmative action is one of the tools that I believe came about to try to ensure that that liberation achieved through education is more accessible for everyone, regardless of race, class, and all of the other categories that people have used to try to be gatekeepers in education in our country.
Wow. I thought that going last would be a little bit easier. We find in the Gospel of John, the 10th chapter and the 10th verse, Jesus saying, I have come that you may have life and life more abundantly. And so if Jesus in his expression in the gospels talks about an abundant life, right? It's not just restricted to some, but to all. And so if we look at affirmative action as that which helps for those who are disenfranchised to be able to have access to an abundant life, then it is a faith and theological issue, because we know that in this country and even other, all throughout this world, that there are efforts and legislation and other practices that are meant to make sure that some groups have access and some don't. And so to create space for people to have that which God has intended for us to, for us in our lived experience, right? Not to belittle any others, but to make sure that we're all able to have access to an abundant life. And I think that I want to say that affirmative action is a faith and theological issue. Yes, of concern. So, yeah.
Great. I'm going to push us all a little deeper then, or invite us deeper. How is affirmative action a response to sin?
Well, and this is a little bit more challenging. I got to bring back some of my theological education, but maybe not necessarily talking about so much individual sin, more so than communal sin, right? And where we recognize that where one suffers, right, where people are dealing with being disenfranchised, dealing with the sin of racism and the sin of all these other isms that exist in the world. Affirmative action is one of those things that helps to seek to remedy and redeem us from some of the very historical challenges that we face. And so we know that even the work itself may not be perfect in execution, but the spirit of it is meant to make sure that people have access. And so I believe that, addressing the communal sins, right, addressing the very, very, very interesting, to say the least, history of people of color in the United States, and not just here, but all throughout the diaspora. What does it mean to make sure that there is room at the table for people who have been systematically excluded for a very long time, right? And so I think that is how it addresses the issue of sin. As a matter of fact, it really seeks to do just what Jesus does, right? Make sure that those who are at a disadvantage now have an opportunity where there's somebody who fills the gap. And so,
I'm thinking about it the same way that he's using the language of communal sin, and I was thinking in my mind corporate sin, systemic sin. I know we're not even allowed to talk about things being systemic anymore, that language is literally legally barred from arguments at this point.
Not at MTS.
Not at systemic, then I'll get it out. But the way that power has been hoarded, specifically looking at in our country over time, were individual decisions that were made to keep people out, particularly people with Black and brown skin. And so we have continued and are very much right now in another one of those flashpoints of perpetuating that gatekeeping of power by pretending that we all have equal opportunity in this country, which is a lie. It is a lie. And we have the data to show that it is a lie. But we are perpetuating this sort of myth of rugged American individualism, that any person has the same shot in life. But it doesn't matter where they were born, when they were born, but that we are all on equal footing in terms of opportunities, and that is a lie. And we know that it is a lie, and perpetuating systems that reinforce that lie is sin to me.
Yeah, if I could just add to you all's wonderful comments there, I think that I most certainly agree with everything you all said. If I could push a little further, I think that affirmative action as a response to sin is also a reflection of the half-hearted attempt to reverse that sin, right? I think about, as I sit here, when I've made mistakes or done something quote unquote sinful, I might do good for a season and get right back in trouble, right? If any of us have that story, right? Where we get better for a season, or our communities get better for a season. But it's a half-hearted effort. We do it for a season to get what we think is favor from God, or curry favor from God. And as soon as God does what we want, we're right back into the frying pan, into the fire, if you will. And so that's why I see a lot of ways of affirmative action as being an attempt, right? But half-hearted, because on the one hand, you offer the 60s this opportunity to folks of color who have not had opportunities previously there to attend certain institutions, but you don't bring with it the things those institutions are going to help people of color thrive, right? So there's a pushback against community center for people of color on campus when they get to campus, so they can actually stay there and thrive in those spaces, right? There's pushback against hiring DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion persons, to support those people once they get to campus. So I see affirmative action as something that was meant to try to address corporate systemic sin. But in a lot of ways, I felt like it was somewhat of a half-hearted attempt. When you still had, once folks got there, there's very few people that actually existed that actually could support said students, right? I was reading an article before today's conversation, and the writer he said he entered Emory as a Black man in 1994 out of a class of 1,000 students. There were less than 25 Black men in his class. He was just saying, like, look, we got there, but once we got there was nothing there for us to actually thrive and actually be a part of the community. And so I think it's a reflection that so many times in our history as Americans, we have opened a door of opportunity or set a door of opportunity, and then not giving folks the need to actually thrive once they get that opportunity, right? So I see it as most certainly an attempt to reverse corporate sin, but also another attempt in a long legacy of a half-hearted effort to do what should have been done, but hasn't gone far enough.
Well, I want to say, first of all, I agree with everybody. I don't think we're going to disagree at all. But I do want to throw in a little monkey wrench. And, race has been called America's original sin. And it really was, because it wasn't dealt with under the Articles of Confederation, wasn't dealt with in Congress, and within the Constitution. And of course, the Equal Protection Clause just came about after we fought a terrible war, and the 14th, 13th, and 14th Amendments were adopted. And to prepare for this panel, I went back and read 3 decisions. One was the Bakke decision, one was the Grutter decision, and the last one was this Harvard decision that was recently passed down. And one of the discussions in there, just to give you a little quick lesson on how to think about equal protection. Equal protection means that if you're going to treat people differently, equality is the goal, and not preferential treatment, but equality is the goal. It's the equal protection of the law, not one person have a greater protection than another person. That's the goal. And so if a government, a state or a national government wants to pass a law that treats its citizens differently, then it has to have a compelling state interest. And the case is going to be looked at with much greater scrutiny than any another type of law. That's the second tier of the Equal Protection Clause analysis. The first tier is if there's a rational connection between the law and a governmental function, a legitimate governmental function, the court's not going to interfere. But if it involves race or any other protected class of citizen, or if it involves a fundamental right under the Constitution, then you go to the second tier, which is strict scrutiny and compelling state interest. So there's a discussion of compelling state interest in all 3 of these cases. And what we've been discussing this morning is discussed in the cases. And in the Bakke case, or in the Grutter case, they asked the government, the school, which was the University of Michigan, what their compelling interest was, their compelling state interest. Of course, the University of Michigan is considered to be a state actor because they're a state institution. So they said that one of our goals or our compelling interest is to alleviate past wrongs. And that sounds great, doesn't it? We should all be about alleviating past wrongs. And that's about sin too, isn't it? Because if we've sinned in the past and we need to correct that, we need to change, we need to make amends. But the Supreme Court said that alleviating past wrongs is not a compelling state interest. You got to come up with something else, because they said if everybody has been the victim of a past wrong somewhere along the line, and everybody would be able to reach back in history and find a time when they were wronged. And so this is not a compelling state interest that withstands strict scrutiny. I was kind of shocked by that, because I thought government should be, in a way, trying to alleviate past wrongs. So what happened is that this is a long answer to a short question, but they had another compelling interest, which was to make a diverse student body, because a diverse student body would tend to educate that student body more fully, because you would be exposed to different points of view. And that was considered by the Grutter court as a compelling state interest. And that's why and they say that you can use race, but it can't be the only reason in weighing people's applications and deciding who gets in, who gets out. But this whole idea of systemic sin and we got to fix it and all that kind of thing, that's not a compelling state interest, which I thought was kind of remarkable.
Go ahead, Michael.
Can I take the conversation just a little bit further? Because I mean, these are some remarkable comments here today. And one of the things that came to mind for me as I was listening to my other panelists was, thinking about, like Dr. Blunt said, affirmative action being a half-hearted attempt, right? And so really in terms of how I look at affirmative action, or how I interpret it, is making sure that there's a seat available at the table. But if there are so many obstacles that keep you from even getting to the table, right? How is it really truly, effective, right? Because it's like, well, I made sure that there was a seat at the table, right? And even now we're dealing with the seat being taken away, right? And so it makes me think about the gospel according to Mark, where Jesus crosses over to the other side of the lake, and he goes to the Gerasene. Y'all got that pronounced right? Mm-hmm. All right, y'all stay with me. I just want to make sure. But when I think about the man who is of course demon possessed, and of course possessed by the demons named Legion, right? The conflict for Jesus in this community is not while he's dealing with this man's ailments or his issues. The conflict for Jesus in this community, where he gets barred and banned, is when he exorcises the demons into the pigs and causes a problem for the profit of those who are the local people, right? And so when I think about that, when we talk about state interests, right? When we think about even racism, in my argument, which is a byproduct of a capitalistic endeavor, right? Because even to get to the point of racism, you have to create this division so that there's opportunities, right, to create even further profits, right? So, and I think about these things, and what I'm essentially saying is that that having the existence of affirmative action is one step in the right direction, but it's still not enough, right? But to take away affirmative action says to all these other groups that are disenfranchised, who don't have the opportunity to even do what they need for themselves, right, to get to the table, right, create a whole world of justice, ethics, and theological issues. Because if I am like this man, right, running around and cutting myself and everything, how can I even get to the point, right, where I can add anything of value to contribute to the community? That beyond affirmative action, there has to be efforts in the community of healing, right, the damage that has been done to leave us, in the position of being a demoniac in the first place, right? And many people, particularly within our communities all over now, we see as a byproduct of the pandemic, are dealing with mental health issues. They're dealing with physical. I mean, the plethora of challenges for people within our communities are continuing to grow. And what we notice is that this is not just something that's happening within Black and Brown communities. It's beginning to impact everyone everywhere. When we look at the what is it called? The epidemic with crystal meth and everything else like that, like where drugs are just not just running rampant or isolated to Black and Brown communities, but now we have persons who are all throughout dealing with the lack of the addressing of the systemic challenges in this country, having affirmative action and some and more beyond that, I think is more imperative now than ever. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts.
So I'm gonna go back to what Jack was just sharing with us about compelling state interest. And one observation I'm making is that it's not surprising in a classical liberal state that there's not interest in the past. That American political culture, political ideology has often denied the importance of the past. So it's interesting, the Supreme Court's right in line with that. I'm curious about, so the other one, the value of diversity, how did the recent court case address that? What did they argue?
Yeah, so well, they kept going back to the fact that if you go back to the 14th Amendment, and that's the law is the law, and it says what it says, and they are not creating law technically, but they are interpreting law. And the Equal Protection Clause says no state or federal government can deny any person the equal protection of the law. So it's the amendment is race neutral, you see. And so, of course, people like Bakke were complaining, I'm white and some Black person got into medical school ahead of me. So, but the Supreme Court keeps coming back and saying that it has to be race neutral. We're not going to allow race to be the sole criterion in determining who gets into medical school. And so your question is, how did they get around what now?
Value of diversity.
The value of diversity. Well, one of the things they said is that what affirmative action had done was one of the things they talk about is stereotyping people. And they're saying if you want someone who is African American to be able to attend law school because it'll give a difference of opinions, you're assuming that all African Americans have the same opinions on all issues. And he says that's not right. That's wrong. Different people, whether they're Black or white, have differing opinions on different political issues. And so that is a falsity that the University of Michigan had assumed when they were developing their admissions policies. So, and they also, one of the big problems with it is that to violate, and really these admission standards are violating the equal protection of the clause because they're giving a bump up to certain categories of people. That if you're going to do that to withstand strict scrutiny, which is the test, then it has to be limited in terms of time and geographic area, technically. And so they said that these admission policies at Harvard had no end date. And they just kept going on and on and on into perpetuity. As a matter of fact, Harvard used data from previous years and percentages of minority participation as a sort of a touchstone to determine how many African Americans or minority groups they should admit. So it wasn't specifically limited in terms of time. And Sandra Day O'Connor, in her opinion in Grutter, had said, I think that it should be limited, she said. This affirmative action. And I think, and this was back in the 90s, and Bakke was in the 70s. And she says, it's been 20 years since Bakke. And I think in another 25 years, we won't need affirmative action. And of course, and so the conservative court we have now leapt upon that and said hadn't been 25, but by the time the people who are in school now will have graduated, it will be 2025. And we're putting a termination date on affirmative action, and that's what they did. So
I think what is confusing and probably a little offensive to me, having been somebody who worked in higher education for a number of years and been privy to the process of admission selections, is that you keep saying race can't be the only factor.
right.
It's never the only factor.
Yeah.
Even with affirmative action, it wasn't, oh, here's somebody who checked a person of color box. They're the fifth one in line. We'll put them in the admit pile. Like that universities, higher education institutions have a vested interest in admitting students who they expect will be successful at their institutions, who will thrive at their institutions. We can talk about the whole thriving thing later, but that there is a vested interest in the process that says that race was never the only factor. So that
assumption
in and of itself is so deeply flawed.
Yeah. Well, they bring that out in these decisions. They talk about how that race can only be one factor among many.
Right.
And so if you
always
are
was.
from a rural area, you might bring, as a matter of fact, the court says somebody from the Midwest, from, Jackson, Mississippi, might bring a different point of view to a Bostonian. And I can see how that would be true. But you have to remember that there is this strict scrutiny. And in order to withstand strict scrutiny, there has to be measurable type of, you have to be able to measure and quantify how well you're doing in achieving these goals of having a diverse student body. And the language that was used by Harvard was, well, we want to make good decision makers. We want people to be able to think, to be good thinkers and to be good problem solvers. And the court said, there's no way that we can scrutinize that to determine if it's race neutral. And so because of the vagueness of the goals that you've got in mind, they denied them that, and they weren't using race as the only factor. They were using it as a one factor among many. So and it was struck down.
With how subjective all of this is, if Harvard doesn't change a thing about what it's doing and keeps doing everything the same way with the same commitment to creating diverse student populations, how does someone come after them? How does someone stop them?
Say that again, please.
If we'll say any institution who has been using some form of affirmative action to create balanced student populations, if they don't change anything about what they're doing, can anybody ever prove in court that they did something wrong?
Yeah, I mean, that's what happened in this case, is that there was a group called the Students for Fair Entry Standards or something. And it was put together basically to have a group with standing to challenge Harvard's way of doing things. And they filed a lawsuit, said it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution because it's vague and indefinite. And also they claimed that there was a negative factor involved, not just a positive factor, in that if you prefer one group of people, you are by the very nature of things negating another group of people.
So if I prefer people who scored the highest on the LSAT, I am discriminating against people who got moderate scores on the LSAT?
No, I know, but you see, what you're doing now is that you're creating a compelling state interest in education and educating people. And that's good. But their compelling state interest was diversity of student body, which they thought would lend to the education process. And it does. I can tell you right now, I've benefited from being in a diverse population here at Memphis Theological School. But they felt that those goals were too nebulous
Yeah.
to be able to be analyzed under strict scrutiny. No, you can't get your head around how well you're doing and progressing to that goal. So because it was nebulous and vague, it was considered to be a violation of the equal protection clause.
Let me jump in here and because the issue has come up that I think has helped to drive the opposition to affirmative action, which is that if one group is getting preference, then another group is being dissed, right? That there's that negative, so they're negating a group of people. So here we have theologians. I'd like to have you reflect on how is it within Christianity that we can ask people to be negated? And that might not be a really good way to ask the question, but is there an element within Christianity that asks us to give of ourselves to do something in response to sin?
Oh, can I chime in?
Yeah.
Jesus says, you want to be one of my disciples, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. And in that particular context, he's not talking to people who are already suffering. He's talking to people who are aligned with privilege, right? Who are experiencing privilege to align themselves with a form of suffering and punishment that was only reserved for the least of these and the poor. And saying that I want you to align yourselves with them and follow me. That Jesus himself takes on a point and privilege of suffering so that others can have. And so there is, I mean, I think it's spelled out very clear there, but I want to even push it a little bit further to say that I think that even as we have this dialogue, right, I think what is clear for, I would say, dare to say all of us on this panel, is that as we evaluate and have an intentional conversation about affirmative action, we know that this is just a drop in a bucket to address all the many needs in our communities. And so, one of the things that came to mind for me is that this may be a season, right, where really the wheat is able to be separated from the chaff, particularly when I think about some of the statements of Dr. King post-integration. And I said, I'm afraid that I've, invited us to come into a burning building, right? And so, prior to that, we have, where communities were more invested into, taking care and helping to, really deal with a systems and situations that were right there in front of your face, that it was very clear. And maybe what we're experiencing, and maybe this was the kind of nefarious intent of affirmative action anyway, was that it will veil racism just enough to make people feel very comfortable that they don't have to build and invest in their own communities, make sure that, hey, we're actively fighting, right, against some of the deeper root causes of what are really keeping people in this nation behind. And so could it be that we're just, dealing with now the loss of cough medicine as opposed to an antibiotic? And we need to be focusing on antibiotics to actually get to the root of the situation in this country. And this has been one of the divine ways that where God takes maybe the intent of evil and uses it for our good, to where now institutions like MTS can say, hey, even in spite of this, we're still committed to this, right? And we're able to expose corporations, institutions, and other things for what they really are, right? One of the things I was reading about lately about, the enrollment of historically Black colleges in universities, they're almost at all-time highs, right? There is a surge for young Black and brown students to go to HBCUs because of the type of environment that wants to focus on them, right? But even thinking beyond just HBCUs, but the advantage for intentional diverse and inclusive institutions like MTS to be able to hone in and say, we don't need legislation to do this for us. However, we're advocating to make sure that we're the antibiotic and not just the cough syrup, right? To be able to make sure that we are living in a country that is addressing the root causes and not just giving kind of the little pieces of cheese or the little snippets to get people by, just to pacify them enough to make them think that we're living in a very equal, right, society. So those are some of my thoughts there.
Yeah, I think this is, with one of the reasons we're having this discussion is, as a theological school, as that we're trying to encourage a theological response, a faith response to these kinds of court decisions. And that's why I wanted to press about the theological resources that we have to address people who are, and just say white people, who are disturbed by affirmative action. And Michael, what you were just talking about, I think is really important, that it says, look, of course, affirmative action does ask for some sacrifice, right?
Mhm.
But if you believe that redemption comes through sacrifice, that liberation comes through struggle, that there's going to be sacrifice and struggle. There is no pain-free way to address injustice. If you're a person in position of power and privilege because of injustice, you're not going to get to justice without addressing that power and privilege, and that's going to feel, in a way, initially at least, as some kind of harm. But the outcome is we move towards what's been called the beloved community, in which all persons are affirmed and welcomed. And I'm thinking here that there's a recent case in Memphis. It was just in the news this morning of the University of Memphis Law School. I don't know if you've all heard about this, but in the law review office, so that's the students write the law review. It's a journal that they put out. They had a award that they had created that they were going to give to the person who did the best job of editing. And they said that they created this award out of just like stuff that they found around the office. So the award, what it looked like, it's a football, so it's dark. And then they put a wig on it, a black wig. And then they made lips that are hugely red, and then sort of like bug eyes. And the white students didn't see that as offensive. You look at it, and it's a stereotypical caricature of an African-American woman, and they didn't get it. And this is, I think, for the diversity point is maybe they didn't get it because they live in a world that's way too white.
Well, and then speaking, a couple of things come to mind. One, I think, like, going just on the topic of affirmative action, there's a book, forget the person's name, but the book is called When Affirmative Action Was White. And it deals with the fact that a lot of affirmative action policies actually benefit white people, right? So in a lot of ways, the conversation feels like a dog whistle because if you look at the data, there's a lot of cases, affirmative action policies don't actually overly benefit folks of color, right? According to the research from this book. And then on top of that, there's no conversation around legacy advocates, right? And folks who typically are white because folks typically who go to college were white folks, right? But there's been no conversation around legacy advocates of folks who just get admitted, right, because their parents went to school, right? So even the whole conversation we've had, like over the last couple of years on affirmative action, it just feels like an attack on folks of color because for some strange reason, people believe that we are getting ahead, right? Which is just not the case. It's just on every metric. You look at every metric, it's just not the case. It's just not the case, right? There was a study done, I think in 2019, where, as a Yale study, I think done, where folks believed, the population group believed that for every $100 that a white family had, Black folks had $90. The data actually said for every $100 a white family had, Black folks had $10, right? So like we're not making a lot of progress to be for real. Like it might feel like it because we see oh my goodness, Barack Obama was the first black president, or Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first black woman Supreme Court. This might feel like these one-offs of progress, but we really haven't made a lot of significant progress, right? But on your theological point, Pete, I'm thinking a lot about your description and Pastor Moore's description, and a lot of what it means to be a Christian, to be a follower of Jesus, right? One of my touch points that like grounds me specifically in my life is the greatest commandment, right? Matthew the 22nd chapter, in which Jesus tells his disciples, look, at the end of the day, there are two laws that everything hangs on, right? Loving God and loving others. And we have painted this rosy picture of love being a nice emotional connection, doesn't require anything of us. And that's just far from the case. Like, if we're actually gonna love God and love others, it requires sacrifice, giving of ourselves. And we've created this individualistic Christianity that says, all I need to be concerned about is making sure I'm saved with God and I'm all set, right? That God exists to grant my wishes and my desires, and I'll go to heaven, I'm all set. When that's not the witness I see in the Gospels, in the whole biblical narrative, quite frankly. I see a Jesus that didn't talk very much, quite frankly, about believing in him and for personal salvation, but much more so about how do we treat one another while we're here on this earth, right? Some people talking about it like this: we've created a religion about Jesus, but we have done a terrible job of following the religion of Jesus, right? And so I think that, like, theologically speaking, we've got to do do a complete reinterpretation of actually what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ, follower of the way, as Scripture offers for us, right? And I tell this to my students that oftentimes we talk about salvation as being something that John 3:16, right? We can quote John 3:16, we learn it very often as children, right? But I see a very different Jesus in Matthew talks about, look, when I decide to come back in the day of judgment and judge folks, I'm actually going to judge folks based on what you do for the least of these. Did you clothe me when I was naked? Did you visit me when I was in prison, right? Like that for him in the Gospel of Matthew is, at least Matthew 25, is what he says really matters, right? And so how do we, in other words, how do we re-understand and reinterpret what does it actually mean to be a Jesus follower, right? What does it actually mean to say that you give your life up for Christ, right? What does it actually mean for you to say, Jesus, you're Lord of my life, right? Salvation is fantastic, it's great, it's wonderful, right? It's a blessing to know Jesus, right? But like, I read somewhere in Scripture that also Jesus prays that thy will be done on heaven as it is on earth. Meaning for me, we can experience some of heaven on earth. May not be fully here, but we can experience some of it right here, right now. So I think, to your question, Pete, I think it begs us, this whole conversation begs us to really get back at the core of what's it actually mean to be a Jesus follower. And I think that we've lost the plot, if you will. The church has lost the plot in a lot of ways.
You know, I'm taking a course right now from Dr. Mitzi Minor on Paul's Corinthian correspondence. And I've learned that the church in Corinth was a pretty crazy place to be. I mean, it was very divisive. There are all sorts of sects and different people were following Apollos and Cephas, and there were slaves and free and Jews and Gentiles, and I think this course has taught me that I'm going to encounter people who are different from me, and that's just the nature of the world, and I have to learn to accept and tolerate people who think differently than I do. And I think the First Corinthians, sermons on First and Second Corinthians, might be a good way to talk to white people who feel like they're being dissed, because this is a story about the very formative edges of Christianity in the early days, and I think that might help. But don't preach that to the Supreme Court, because their Bible is the Constitution. And if it ain't in the Constitution, they're not going to consider it, you know.
Though, this may be our place to end, so we can have our snack. The Supreme Court does respond to popular movements or to political pressure, even though it pretends not to. And so it does make a difference whether or not there's popular support for a particular policy or not. And I think that's why it's important for students in theology schools and for faculty and staff and everybody to have these kinds of discussions where we try to think through theologically and not just legally, the legal analysis is really important to see like where those decisions are coming from. But then to see how that legal analysis either does or does not intersect with our theological, our faith convictions, so that we recognize that Supreme Court's not our God. Supreme Court's not our gospel. Supreme Court, federal government is not our God or our gospel, but our God and our gospel calls us to some different ways of being in the world. And that calls us into solidarity with people who are hurting, who have been excluded, and it calls us into sacrifice in order to right those wrongs, especially for those of us who are in positions of privilege and power. With that in mind, I'm going to draw us to a close. I'd like to thank our panelists. Ask if there are 2 questions from our august audience. Ed.
I have one question. Jack, you mentioned geography, I think. You think that the Supreme Court would consider geography as a basis for achieving that diversity goal?
Well, I may have misused that word geography because it's going to apply to everyone in the United States, of course.
Well, you use Memphis or Mississippi.
Yes,
from
right.
Harvard, it would create diversity.
Yeah, that person would be entitled to a little plus too, as far as admissions are concerned. So yes, geography was in the mix in the admission policies of Harvard and Michigan when they were making decisions on who to admit or not, because someone from California would have a different point of view than someone from Massachusetts and so on and so forth. But yeah, so that was taken, but still, again, you can't use that as the sole criterion. It has to be one of many criteria rather.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm wondering if I believe we should go after affirmative action as Christians, but I'm wondering if you set your sights too low when what you're attacking ethically and theologically is a few people having access to selective education, and we're not attacking the principle of selective education in the first place. This whole notion of we admit people who can thrive, but we don't change the institution to make sure they can thrive. So should what we be attacking is the idea that an institution should be selective and elite, and not attacking that elitism?
I think very honestly that affirmative action was a good start, but at this point, we need a more comprehensive approach. So prior to even my station in terms of full-time ministry, one of my experiences was working for a nonprofit organization in the high school setting that provided wraparound services for students for their success. And so we identified all the different factors that contributed to dropouts, students dropping out. And in my experience with that particular organization, one of the conversations that took place at that particular time was that this is not just something that needs to happen between K through 12, but this really needs to move over into higher education, because when students go off to school, and I have this personal experience myself, when I went off to college, I had to take out a loan from my church. My mother had to take out a loan from my church just to make sure that the deposit for my room and board was taken care of, so I can have the whole removed from my account. And so I remember for the first few years of being in school, right around the beginning of each semester, my prayer, right, and my struggle and my hustle was to make sure that I could even be able to get the green light to take classes. And then throughout the semester, there are a plethora of challenges that come about and arise that are competing factors to me being able to be fully present in class. And I'm sure even in theological education, with many of the students here, they're dealing with an entire world of challenges outside of the classroom. And so I think we need a more comprehensive approach to make sure that, just like I was talking about with the man in Mark chapter 5, that he's able to get out of the areas where he's harming himself, where he's dealing with things that are tormenting him, so that he can be present in his right mind, right? And so for many people, their lives are clouded with other concerns, from loved ones who are sick that need to be taken care of, to bills that need to be paid, to housing challenges and issues. And this is something that's impacting people in every single institution. And so the only people who are left right now without that kind of wraparound support, who are able to thrive and prosper, are those who have the type of support systems already in place.
Thanks again, all. We have pizza and some other snacks over here. So thanks again to the panel and thanks to our audience.